Any questions on chapter one? I kind of did a quickie on this one last week when we talked about some of our intro to the architecture, and there were some YouTubes from last time. Fairly basic information about the internet. We talked about most of it already, I think. Basically, that the course is going to involve HTML5. We'll get into that. CSS3 and JavaScript. And we talked about the history and evolution of the internet, how it started with the ARPANET, became the internet, and now we're in what's known as the Web 2.0 or going social phase, and going mobile too. Mobile is the next big thing. A lot of the stuff that's in HTML5 is all about going mobile. Talked briefly about client-side and server-side programming. We will concentrate mostly on client-side programming. That's in the browser, mostly with JavaScript. We'll also get into smartphones and tablets. HTML5 has some nice things for that. Everyone's heard Moore's Law. Technology doubles every 2 years. One of the founders of Intel. Been very accurate law, actually. Okay, so we talked about some of the up-and-coming things in the web. Is in my field, the electronic health record is a big deal. And I've got more information on my website about it if anyone's interested. So that's a big deal, and giving consumers access to their electronic health record. So that's one big thing that's coming. Human Genome Project is another one kind of tied into health record. Of course, there's all kinds of things that are coming to help society, Amber Alerts, and cloud computing is kind of the big thing. Cloud computing really isn't much different than what we call hosted computing today, so it's kind of a remarketing of it more than anything else to allow you to put your files on a server somewhere else instead of having to maintain it and maybe buy other services like Google applications instead of installing Microsoft Office and stuff that's kind of been around a while but remarketed as the cloud now. Global positioning devices, I'm sure you're familiar with that. Robots are becoming a big thing. Did anyone, well, if you take the 254 class, which is the Intro to Java Programming, sometimes they do some robot programming there. That's kind of cool. That's the Java language, does a lot of that, including NASA's rovers. And of course, you're all familiar with email messaging, video chat, FTP for transferring files, iTunes, Internet TV. You can really get everything on your computer these days. Game programming is another one. On websites, game programming has been done primarily with Flash, but because of Apple to no small extent, it's now moving to HTML5, CSS3, and jQuery, which is a big one. So this is kind of the driver. This standard is not even set yet, but it really promises to take over, not just on the web, but also on mobile devices. So it's really strongly emerging. We used to call this XHTML, but that's kind of gone by the wayside. They're just calling it HTML5 now. Cascading style sheets, we'll talk about that. We'll get into that maybe next week or the week after. And JavaScript, which is programming, allows you to it's really the brains behind rich web applications, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the semester. Web browsers and browser portability. I think Google is probably the best browser, although I kind of like Opera too. Opera's not bad. So as you can see, market share is changing all the time. Google's now got 17%, Firefox 20%, Apple 7%, and Microsoft Internet Explorer is only 40%. I remember when they were 95% at one point. They don't even show up on the mobile phone market. And we'll talk about canvases a little bit later in the semester. There's a lot of drawing. This is a new thing to HTML5 as well. It's pretty cool. Allows you to do some drawing and stuff. jQuery is a very popular library that also has to do with JavaScript for creating user interfaces that are like real GUI type window applications. There are validation sites that are useful as well. We can look at some of these a little bit later. And those are the core technologies we're going to be looking at: HTML5, CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, and also the document object model. More information and demonstrations. Again, the history, we already talked about the ARPANET. Started in the late 60s, the ARPANET went live. In early 70s, they were connected using a 56 kps baud speed modem, which was a lot back then. Most consumer computers, when they first came out, had 110 bits per second. Originally called the ARPANET, eventually became the Internet that we all know today, as we discussed last week. And it works on the concept of packet switching. Data is sent in packets because communication lines are often interrupted. So instead of having to resend the whole message every time it's interrupted, you just resend a packet or a small part of it. And we talked about TCP/IP, which is the transmission control protocol, and IP is the Internet Protocol, which are the two protocols that the Internet is largely built on. And this is also what Unix and Linux systems are built on. When both Microsoft and Apple started networking, they had their own networking protocols that were proprietary, and they didn't want to agree with each other. Apple was AppleTalk, I think, and Microsoft was, there was Novell, and then Microsoft had its own protocol. But when the Internet came out, they all wanted to be able to work on the Internet, and then all of a sudden they decided they could cooperate. And so they all went on the TCP/IP protocol. Bandwidth is really just how wide your pipe is or your highway is. Certainly is growing quite a bit. Again, the history of it a little bit. The European Organization for Nuclear Research, the same people that have brought you the Super Collider, did a lot of work on the Internet. They were a subcontractor with the military originally, and they are also largely responsible for the first prototype of the web browser in the HTML language. And it was one of their own from Chicago, European Swiss guy, I believe. What was his name? Who created Netscape in Chicago while he was studying there. Anytime you see S on one of these protocols, it stands for secure. If you've got a bank account or something like that, and you go to their site, and the HTTPS or the HTTP link starts with HTTP and it doesn't have an S on it, and it's already showing you your bank account balance, take your money elsewhere. It's not secure. Again, the Mosaic, which was basically the prototype, created Netscape. Mark Andreessen, there he is, Mark Andreessen. That was his name. Web 2.0 that you hear a lot of is really sort of the resurgence of the web in 2004 after the collapse in 2001. It's generally referred to as Web 2.0 technologies, but these are sort of a collection of technologies that were really emerging in the late 90s and early 2000s, but because of the bust, didn't really become very popularly used until the recovery. So a lot of those technologies, although they've been around more than 5 years, were associated with the resurgence of 2004 and were referred to as Web 2.0 technologies. A lot of them were popularized by Amazon and PayPal and Google and Facebook and ones like that. We'll get into some basics of HTML tonight. And we'll again talk about hyperlinks, all kinds of things, including downloading files. You're probably familiar with that already. The URI is a Uniform Resource Identifier. Generally start with an HTTP and then an address. So we talked about this a little bit already. The web client goes over the internet to a web server to make a request, and then gets a response. Talked about that last week. And there's two ways of doing it. There's generally called the GET protocol and the PUT protocol. More or less, there's some differences in how they work, but you don't generally have to worry about that too much. And it will give back statuses as well. And on MIME extension, you have to worry about if you start mixing text with non-text like images. And most web pages do that these days, so that's something you do have to be worried about at some point. Get and post, I'm sorry, it should be post, not put, are the protocols for sending data and getting data back using the HTTP or Hypertext Transport Protocol. There's not a lot of difference. I'll probably talk about get and post when we it'd be easier to understand it when you see some examples. Client-side caching is when the browser caches stuff or keeps stuff in memory so it doesn't have to keep going back to the server for more information. Can be useful, can also be a pain. Multi-tier applications, we talked about this last week as well. We talked about a browser going to a web server, which has probably got some intelligence in here, and also linked to an application server, which ultimately goes out to a database. Does some stuff. You go up to Amazon, you search for a book, the books are stored in the database, it does a query against the database, and sends results back. Is a dynamic web page, meaning that that web page doesn't exist on the server anywhere, but the intelligence, the application intelligence, whether it be Java or PHP or whatever, constructed that web page based on, what you said you wanted to search for. And these are generally called tiers. Bottom tier, generally the database tier. The middle tier is usually the program logic, the application server. The presentation tier is generally the web browser itself. And controller tier can also be part of the application or the database. Yeah, business logic is generally in the middle tier, and that's kind of the rules by which the application lives, to check if something's in stock or out of stock, any business rules you might have. Talked about server-side scripting versus client-side scripting. Most of this class, or a large chunk of it, will be client-side scripting. That's JavaScript. On the server, there's a couple of options. We'll probably look at PHP at the very least, and possibly even Java. World Wide Web Consortium was a consortium of the major companies developing for the web. Still exist, and they set standards. Apple, IBM, Microsoft, Oracle, all those big companies are on it. Google. So Web 1.0 is relatively simple. It's what we call a brochure. And it didn't do anything too fancy, although that's not entirely true because Amazon was around in the Web 1.0 world. They were actually one of the early creators of a lot of what's referred to as Web 2.0 programs. Web 2.0 definitely becomes more interactive. There's a lot better technology. It makes it more interactive and rich. So you think Web 1.0 is maybe being able to look at a newspaper online, brochure. Web 2.0 is something like Facebook, very interactive. Google, founded in 1996. They named it Google in 1997, and it became very popular very quickly. Obviously, we know the rest. We'll also look at web services and mashups, but that's much later in the semester. There's a whole bunch of web services you can look at that are provided for you, and we'll look at some of them. I use YouTube, for example, for uploading stuff, but there's others as well. Social services, obviously, social networks are the big thing right now. A lot of that's done on these websites. AJAX is another term. It stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Although at this point the XML should be dropped because it's not using XML too much. Asynchronous is like a conversation that you don't wait for a response for, like an email conversation. A synchronous conversation is like a telephone conversation where you're waiting for a response. And JavaScript is the brains behind it. XML used to represent the transport layer, or the data and how it was sent, although not too many places use XML anymore because it's too wordy and slow. Most of them use something called JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation. These are just more examples of social sites. Let's see what they have. They have anything. So this is kind of a database you see right here, and we talked about how data gets translated into zeros and ones ultimately on the database. That's just kind of an example of that. Okay, bits, 8 bits make a byte, make a character. We talked about that last week as well. Fields are made up of bits or characters. Records or rows in a database are made up of fields. So a record might contain an employee ID, their name, their address, their hourly pay, and things like that. That would be a record, an employee record. In databases, we generally call them a row. Files might be where you store those records, or in a database would be more common that you would store rows of data. And of course, some of our popular operating systems. Linux is number one for servers. Windows and the Mac OS on the desktop. And of course, you've got all your different types of phones and tablets as well, which are very popular. Okay, so Linux is a very popular operating system. If you want to play around with Linux, you get a try at it. The one that's really easy to use is Ubuntu. And the two popular mobile operating systems are Apple's iOS and the Android. I have Apple, though I'm starting to prefer Android because it's more open source based on Linux and Java. Different types of programming languages. We're going to deal mostly with JavaScript, which is an interpreted language, which has a lot of advantages over non-interpreted languages. We'll get into that when we get into JavaScript programming. The lineage is sort of pretty straightforward. There's C. From C came C++. Objective-C was really more of an offshoot of C. Visual Basic was completely different. C# came from a combination of C++ and Java came from C++. PHP, which is a very popular scripting language for web pages, and very easy to script in as well. There's a couple of others. Python is pretty good. JavaScript, which we'll spend a lot of time on, is good. And Ruby on Rails. Scala is a new one that I haven't heard about yet. Object technology, we'll get into this a little bit. I don't want to wear you out, but most programming languages are object-oriented, although JavaScript is not quite there yet. So I don't really want to get too much into object-oriented stuff. Surprised they do it, but it's going into an object-oriented world. Interesting stuff here. We'll probably come back to it. Messages and methods. This does come into play in some of the Web 2.0 stuff later on. Encapsulation is an important pillar of object-oriented programming, we call it. It's about information hiding. I'll get into that a little bit more when we get to JavaScript. Inheritance is also, although JavaScript doesn't support it. Okay, I went through this one pretty quickly, but that's because we did most of this last week in class, and also there were YouTube links for it as well. Is there any questions on Chapter 1? We're going to jump into Chapter 2, which we'll go through much more slowly.